I'm Petar Vucenovic from Schoolcraft College. I'd like to welcome everyone to the afternoon sessions. And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, or keynote speaker, Dr. Cathy N. Davidson. Dr. Davidson's slide deck will be available on the conference website, as well as we will be posting a link in the chat. One of Dr. Cathy Davidson's first graduate students while she taught at Michigan State University was Professor Berg, whose class I am currently enrolled in as a first semester student. This makes me one of Dr. Davidson's grad students. There is more than 20 other grad students in the audience today who Dr. Davidson has influenced, whether it be indirect or directly, in a positive way. Welcome, Dr. Davidson.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to, and very soon I'm going to go to presenter view. I'm dyslexic and I'm very good at technology, but when I'm in a situation like this, my technology brain disappears. So you're going to have to bear with me if it takes a while to make that change. I also always love to tell people I'm dyslexic because I've published a lot of books and taught at a lot of different places. And I was a terrible high school student. I was kicked out 4 times. I had a wonderful high school teacher that saved me from being expelled. I owe her a lot in my life. I also owe my father a lot because he would travel around. I've just lost the screen. What's going on?
We can see what you're sharing. It's a woman in a blue dress.
Nope, that's not what I'm sharing. So that's not me.
Oh, I think somebody else accidentally shared.
Here, let me do it. I can do it. I was going to do a preamble first, but I will share that right now.
Okay, I think somebody else accidentally shared.
Okay, so let's try this. And presenter view, slide, no. Play from start. There. Can everybody see the slides? Should be a opening slide that says ensuring every student's success.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm a little person I'm a thumbnail?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you so much, Steve. One of my first students ever at Michigan State. I still bleed green all these years later. And Petar, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Today, I'm going to do a little bit of a history lesson because I think history is one of those great tools that help us to understand not only where we are, but where we're going. If we understand how these crazy systems were created, it helps us also understand that we can create better systems in the future. We realize these weren't things that were just handed down from time immemorial, but actually real people like us made them and we can unmake them. I think that's very, very empowering. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes and then we're going to do an exercise together and then we'll do a Q&A either in chat rooms or just as a free-for-all on Zoom, either way. Let me see. Yes. So this talk is dedicated to all of our students. I like to say the one defining quality of higher education, whether you're at Harvard or at any university in the country, any college in the country, any community college, the difference between higher education and high school is one word: voluntary. No one forces you to go to college. Humans are terrible at voluntary activities. The business model of your local gym is based on the fact that you're going to pay a whole year's membership in advance and you will not be using that gym after February. They count on it. They count on our inability to voluntarily do things that are good for us in the long run, because we're not. I have such admiration for students that with all the other distractions in life, with right now a climate saying that college doesn't matter, even though we know it does, and especially if you're from a lower income group, it's the single most important driver for social mobility. But all of the rhetoric right now is college doesn't matter, you'll never get a job. That you are in college is, to me, amazing. I can barely not have dessert at night when I'm trying to lose 5 pounds. And you are in college for 2 years or 4 years or however long. That's amazing to me. So this is dedicated to you for inspiring all of us for the commitment you're making, not only to your own social mobility, but to fixing this crazy future we've bequeathed to you. You're learning how to do the things that are going to be necessary to save this world. We haven't given you a very good one. And I have faith in you because of what you're doing right now. I want to start with an epigraph. And this is from the famous writer Arundhati Roy, who says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I think that's a really inspiring way to look at this dreadful time we're in. We can walk through. People in the past in pandemics have walked through, and we can walk through lightly and we can imagine a better world. This is not such a great world, and this is the world of the 19th century. The great project of the 19th century, was to train farmers to be factory workers, to train shopkeepers to be corporate citizens, right? Basically, there is nothing about factory work, the standardized, everybody doing the same thing in the same way at the same time, that is natural. Right? When we're left to our own devices, that's not what we do. School was literally to school you for this world. Top down, you had a teacher telling you what to do, or a supervisor, a shop runner telling you what to do, and you did it as you were told, when you were told to do it. It was also about specialization, right? If you're a farmer, I don't know how many people in this audience are farmers. I always ask every audience to raise their hand if they're farmers, and fewer people raise their hands. Maybe in Michigan, there's still some farmers. In my first marriage, my late husband was from a ranching family. I'm from inner city Chicago, so ranching was like a miracle to me. It was so amazing. But what I learned from ranchers was you're constantly having to make decisions, not because someone tells you to, but because you're using your judgment to respond to a crisis. Your cow is in the barbed wire. If your to-do list said you had to fix the barbed wire, no, you get your cow out of the barbed wire first, right? There's a million things like that. In a factory, it's a disaster if you don't know how to do the right thing at the right time when your boss tells you to do it, when the assembly line comes your way. The phrase grading comes from the thing that didn't fit through the assembly line that literally fell off the grade on the chute that put a product on the next phase of the assembly line. Everything about education is training you for factory work. In higher education, and I'm not going to read this whole slide, it'll be there on your slide deck. This is the time higher education, modern higher education, is invented. At the same time, there's this whole science of standardization. How can we make everything the same? How can we have punch clocks and assembly lines and mass production? And everything you see in the bottom part of that slide, scientific learning management, are things that barely existed or were not institutionalized before 1860 and were fully in place by the 1920s. And this is everything from mandatory public schooling to curriculum, to education schools, law schools, collegiate law schools, nursing schools, graduate schools of education, business schools, contact hours, grades, multiple choice tests, SATs, and things like the idea of failure. There was no such thing as A, B, C, D, F grades before. And keep in mind, the F grade is the only grade that's referential. A doesn't stand for anything, B doesn't stand for anything. The F stands for failure because when Mount Holyoke, the first college to put grades into place, invented the A, B, C, D, E grade, everyone freaked out. What if somebody gets an E and the world thinks they're excellent instead of failures? So they changed the E to the F. The second organization to adopt an A, B, C, D, F grading system was the American Meat Packers Association, not another college, the American Meat Packers, who said, that's a great way to evaluate meat and to do the grades of meat. We will reduce everything we know about the meat to this one grade. We'll stamp on it before we ship it to market. Except the American Meat Packers thought sirloin and chuck is way too complicated for a grade. So with every piece of meat, to this day, you can find out who graded it, what is the range of grades they give, and you can find their comments on the piece of meat, something you can't find in a school transcript. I wish we could get rid of all of that complex apparatus of grading, all that complex apparatus of higher education and really boil down college to one question: who are you? This is a question I heard just recently at a conference on popular music, where the music scholar Ann Powers asked pop star, a singer-songwriter, what do you do when you're stopped? What do you do when you hit a blank wall? What do you do when you can't think of what to write next? And she said, what I do is I always ask, who are you? Is what you're learning helping you in some way? Is what you're trying to write in this song really about you, or is it about something else? Earlier in our discussions this morning, somebody said we have to still be tough with students because otherwise they won't be prepared for the job market. I think that's partly true, but I also think so much about education infantilizes you, right? When you go into a job, you're not going to get an ABCD grade on a test. You're going to do your job or not do your job. So the kind of education I value most is education that puts more responsibility on the students for saying, who am I and how do I contribute to this educational experience? What do I contribute and how do I learn to responsibly fulfill that mission? The assembly line method, and that method in the 19th century schoolroom in the other picture, is what's called one-to-many education. That's the assembly line model too. I'm the one, all of my students are the many. Sociologists of education tell us that 80% of students leave a class, even with as few as 8 students, without ever knowing the name of another person in the class except the teacher, right? Why? Because everything about our systems of education are designed to say that only the person at the front of the room counts. Boy, are we missing a lot, right? Your classmates have so much to offer you. And indeed, when you get out into the real world, you'll constantly be involved in projects where you have to work with other people. Everyone hates group projects, and we tend to do a very poor job in higher education of assigning group work. But in fact, in the real work world, probably 90 to 95% of what you do relies on somebody else. You may hate the business manager. The accountant might drive you crazy. But if you have to get a contract out or you have to fulfill something to a contract, that is your new best friend, and you have to learn to work with them. So the more and more ways we can work many to many, where we're sharing our skills, combining our expertise for something better, to me is what really prepares you for life beyond college. The other problem with the 19th century idea of education is it assumes everyone's alike. Why? Because when Charles Eliot, the longest serving president of Harvard, started inventing all the systems for Harvard that you saw on that large sheet of paper, the first school of education, the first medical school, on, all that list. Those are all things he institutionalized during his 40 years as president of Harvard. Only 10% of the population went to college. They went to mostly to elite colleges. Joliet College was the first community college. It was invented in 1910. Most of those things on that sheet, Eliot put into place in about 1890. He created the ranking system for all colleges. And guess which, I bet I don't have to tell you, you're going to be able to guess this pretty quickly, which is the college that serves as the #1 college by which everything else is measured? Of course, it's Harvard. Right? And that was true because he invented the accreditation and the ranking system. He invented the first organization to accredit colleges. And the checklist was things you had at Harvard, the wealthiest university in the nation for the wealthiest students who are from the elite and who are mostly children of Harvard. Our students don't look like that anymore, right? This is an article by my friend and colleague, former president of a LaGuardia Community College, Gail Mello, who in an article in the New York Times talked about the demographics of students today. 18 million undergraduates, right, roughly in the United States. More than 40% of undergraduates are not at Harvard, they're at community college, right? More than 40% of students today work 30 hours a week or more. 25% go to school full-time and work full-time. 25% are over 25 years old, 30% are first-generation college students, 24% are low income, 25% face food and housing shortage. That's just a national disgrace. 58% female, 45% students of color. 0.4% of the nation's students go to school at the Ivies. I would bet 99% of the books about how you should teach college are written by people who went to the Ivies or who teach at the Ivies, right? And most college professors either learned nothing about pedagogy, about how to teach when they were in school, or they were taught to teach students at Harvard. Those lives are set. We're talking about changing lives, how you transform lives. That requires a really different kind of teaching. I'm now going to read a second quote. It's one of my favorite quotes about higher education. And it's going to be a little hard to read there, so I'm going to read it from a sheet I have here, I hope. The great science fiction writer Samuel Delany was an A+++ student at the Bronx School of Science, the most competitive public school in New York. But he was gay and Black, and at 18, he ran, not walked to the West Village, where there would be other students he felt like himself. And he published his first knowledge at 20. He never went to college. When he was 40 years old, as a very famous writer who'd won all the awards, he was invited to teach a class at Wesleyan, and he said he spent more time preparing to teach that college class than in writing any novel. He was so excited about being able to finally be in a college class, and he thought he would ask a question and 100 students would shoot up their hands and all know the answers and be filled with the excitement of the college he never got to go to. This is what he writes. He says this in a film about him, and he actually cries when he says this. Don't you realize that every time you don't, so what happened is he asked a question and only 3 students out of 30 put up their hands. And most college professors think that's a success. If you ask a question and 3 students raise your hand, you think you have full participation. We've got lots of sociology of education people telling us about that too. He saw 3 hands go up and immediately thought, what's going through the mind of those other 27 students? Oh my God. What have I done to kill the intellect and the creativity and the participation of those other 27 students? This is how he talks about it many years later in a film about him. Don't you realize that every time you don't answer a question, you're learning something? You're learning how to make do with what you've got. And you're learning how not to ask for a raise. You're learning how to take it. That's not good. So from now on, whenever I ask a question, everybody's got to put their hand up. I don't care whether you know the answer or not. You have to put your hand up. We need to teach people they are important enough to say what they have to say. I was fortunate enough to attend one of his questions and one of his classes. And sure enough, he asked a question. He teaches it, he's retired now, but he used to teach at Temple University. He asked a question and all of his students raised their hand. What we know from cognitive neuroscience is by that very simple act of raising your hand, it means I am here. It changes your participation in the classroom. He also says, he lets students say, if you raise your hand, you're allowed to say, I don't know the answer, but I think Petar does. So I'm gonna ask Petar if he knows the answer. And if Petar doesn't know, he says, I don't know the answer, but I think Koshela does. So I'll let him see if he can answer. Or I'll ask Dr. Berg, maybe he knows the answer. What it does is it changes the classroom from a competition in the classroom to a project where we're all learning together how to have a voice. That's how you get a job. And that's how you succeed in a job, is learning when to speak, when not to speak, who to go to for answers when you don't have them, whether it's Google or a friend at the office, but how to have that kind of self-direction, not wait for someone to tell you what to do, put it on a syllabus, answer that same thing on a test, A, B, C, D, or none of the above. The world doesn't work that way, right? When have you ever had a complicated, difficult thing to answer in your life? My mom is dying. I don't know what to do. She's the breadwinner in our family. That's not an ABCD question, right? The real questions, the complex, my company's about to fail. That's not an ABCD question, right? How do you learn to think in those complex ways? I like, this is an expression that my organization Futures Initiative has come up with. We cannot change structural inequality with goodwill. We must design new structures with equality at the core. What that means is in the classroom, those 3 students that put up their hand, we've got lots of research on that. They're most likely to match the demographics of the professor, either education levels, background, race, gender, something like that, or aptitude in school, right? That may seem logical, But 27, the total top 100%, as my friend Gail Mello likes to say, all 30 students in that room have a right to their education and to have something they're learning from that will propel them into a future that they're prepared for, not just the 3 that are most like the professor. So the methods I like to teach with are all called inventory methods, and they're all methods, they're all methods that let everybody speak at once without knowing what anyone else is saying, and then putting those ideas together in a creative way. This is another slide. Just, we're all obsessed right now. Every teacher's obsessed with their videos and Zoom. And I think right now, the most important thing we can do, this is a blog I wrote, is ask students, what do you need now in this historic moment? In this moment of great economic uncertainty, of health uncertainty, what do you need now? And the best place to start with that is to ask students. And I'm so happy this conference has been asking you, what makes you anxious? And we'll have time for you to ask students, what do you need most now? In fact, in the chat, what do you need most now in this historic moment? For the teachers out there, inventory methods are something the American Psychological Association calls total participation. And they're techniques for soliciting some kind of higher order thinking from everyone at once. I've used inventory methods with 6th graders in an inner city school in Chicago at a program I was lucky to be involved with several years ago on digital media and learning. That was great. What we did there is we were telling them about technologies we're going to bring to this after school program. And our rule was no one over the age of 12 was allowed to speak for the first hour. And students all got to write on pieces of paper before they knew what anyone else was going to say, what they would most like to do. And we went around the room and everyone read their ideas. It was amazing. We learned so much from that. I've also done this with the top performing, 100 performing CEOs, the top CEO of Sony, of Deutsche Bank, of every major corporation you can think of, because the chairman of the board, John Chambers at that time, was chairman of the board at Duke University, and I did this for where I taught there, and I did this for the trustees at Duke. And he said, you have to do this with my CEOs, because there's no one more sheepish and passive in the world than my CEOs when I'm in the room, right? That's the other problem with the selectivity method. If you ask a question and students raise their hand, you're most likely to get back the answer you have planted as the answer you want to hear. Not necessarily the most creative, the most daring, the most imaginative, but most likely, and again, sociologists of education have studied this extensively, the answer that's most like the answer you've basically planted. Right. And this was John Chambers, Cisco's one of the biggest corporations in the world, saying this about his CEOs, right? This is very human, that we want to please the person above us. Inventory methods are about getting everybody's ideas out there before there's a sort, before we can have groupthink, right? One of the most common methods, I use this in every single class and every single event I do, and we're about to do it and these all work great, by the way, online. I do them all online all the time. We're going to do not a think, pair, share, but a think, share together very soon. In think, pair, share, I have students for 90 seconds write something very simple on a piece of paper, or they can, actually it's easier on a piece of paper because it gets people away from their screens. I usually use index cards. A typical question: what one thing from last week's homework made you mad, made you excited, bugged you, or that you don't understand? Just have students write it on a card. And then you go around the room and have everybody read what's on their card. One of the many things that's amazing is things you never thought to think about come out in that way. They wouldn't come out if you were having the top 3 students, or the 3 students that put their hands up first, begin the class. A second thing is, let's say you read a 15-page essay. If you have 30 people write on a card, the odds are you're going to get 30 different things that people found interesting and are still thinking about, right? That's amazing, because we think we're all reading the same thing. No, we're not. Not at all. We think we're seeing the same TV program. We think we're seeing the same movie. No, we experience the world according to our own experience. You never know that unless you do an inventory method. Another favorite is entry and exit tickets. With entry tickets, I'll do things like this. One of my students invented this. Go to the homework and write down one sentence. Just copy out a sentence you thought was interesting. Again, you find interesting things that you've ignored. I've taught things for 20 years, the same thing for 20 years. Some things like bell hooks I've taught for 20 years. And my students always come up with something that I never knew was there before. It's always exciting. Another friend of mine teaches at McGill University. He teaches 600 students. There's no way to get to meet 600 students, but he always has them do an exit ticket. And he has them do some little thing they've jot down. And then he and his teaching assistants go through the cards to see what students learned in class that day from his lectures. My favorite question of his, he'll say, he teaches a class on modern media, the role of modern media in society. He'll say, what did I lecture on today that you think you're going to still be thinking about tonight? It's going to keep you awake at night. You're going to be mad about it or interested or you're intrigued. And if there wasn't anything, write on your card what we should have been talking about today. And then he bases his next lecture on what was written on those cards. So even in a class of 600, he's finding ways to connect with students and show students they count. Again, sociologists of education have studied this, and they know that simple gesture makes students more likely to come to class, more motivated. They even do better on the most standardized, because he does give standardized tests. Although he does a cool thing on his standardized tests, and this is wonderful. He lets students take a piece of paper, one side only, 8.5 by 11, and they can write any notes they want and bring it into his final exams. His final exams are long A, B, C, D, E, none of the above exams, but they're allowed to bring in a cheat sheet. What he knows, because he's somebody who reads a lot of research, is what you're really learning is not the exam. The exam's actually, we know that you lose 80% of the content of what you studied for an exam the week after an exam. Right? We've got lots of studies that go all the way back to the 1880s on that. If you know there's a final exam and you're studying for a final exam, you're studying to lose 80% of that information by the next week, right? But if you're reading everything you studied in a term and writing it on the cheat sheet for the exam, that's what you learn. Because the process of taking everything you've done in a semester and putting it on this one sheet of paper is an incredibly complex and much more a workforce skill, much more complex thing than just taking an ABCD test, because you're actually thinking to yourself, you're synthesizing, you're making value judgments about what you think is going to be most important, what's going to be on the exam. That's learning. The learning is happening on the cheat sheet, not on the test. So when you think the tests are what prepare you for the world, actually it's not the test, it's your process of cognition, and there's much better processes of cognition. Okay, your turn. So I'm going to end this now, and we're going to go back to the chat, but I'd like you to take 90 seconds, all of you, in the chat. Do you have an inventory method? Do you have a method of finding out what everybody in the room is thinking at once? And you can do this if you're a teacher. What's your method for your students? If you're a student, how do you do it at a club? How do you do it at a meeting? How do you do it in your families? What's a way that everybody can contribute without saying it's only dad's idea that counts? So we have to guess what dad is thinking, right? Or the equivalent. You can do this synchronously or asynchronously when you're teaching. I'm happy to talk about that later on. But for now, 90 seconds. I love to make it quick, low stakes. Write in the chat, and I'm going to get rid of my screen share. Thank everybody for inviting me. Thank Christina Katapodis, my co-author on a book I'm doing on this subject, and who designed these beautiful, beautiful slides. I'm happy to explain what the photos are if you're interested in that later. But for now, I'm going to get out of screen share and see what you're doing in the chat. 90 seconds, and then we'll talk. Now, how do I get out of screen? Stop share.
Yeah.
I'm back. These are great.
And students, feel free to take Dr. Davidson's question as what do you like, or what have you seen that works for you?
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. By the way, most students think this is busy work because they've been told that all that counts is the grade on a test. And then what I have my I'll wait until this is over and then I'll tell what I like to do. I do an evolving resume. All my students make an evolving resume. So I'm seeing a million wonderful ideas over here. This is great. Thank you so much. Let me just quickly talk about the evolving resume because there's so many students in the room and I hope faculty members will think about this. I love to have students bring in a resume the first day of class and then we Google together and find examples that professional job recruiters and job consultants put up of perfect resumes. And I say, hey, what skills don't you have up there? Look, project management is a skill, communication skills, being able to work with people from different cultures is a skill. What kinds of things do you think we can learn this semester that we can check off so you can actually say legitimately on your resume, and when they ask you in an interview, you can tell what this is. What skills do you have that you can put on your resume that you learned in college? Right. Somebody earlier in the conversation said they wish they had a class on how to be an adult. One time, and when I was in the central administration at a university that I taught at, we were changing general education requirements, and I said we didn't need any general education requirements. If we taught an entry-level class that was on how to be an adult, we would manage to cover every field. And as an experiment, I wasn't allowed to call it how to be an adult on the books. That was our pet name for it, but it was something like knowledge in the everyday world. And I had my students the first day of class make lists of all the things they didn't know and they felt they needed to know in the world. And it ran the gamut from statistics to medical advice to collaboration to project management. We managed to cover pretty much the whole curriculum in that semester. And they came away with fantastic resumes as a result. You can all read the chat. There's, and you're going to be saving the chat, Steve, and passing it around, or no?
Well, what we'll be doing is compiling the information and putting it into a more useful form than just here's the chat.
Great.
So we'll organize it after the conference and share it on the conference website, and then let everybody at the conference know when it's available.
That's fantastic. I saw that somebody said that their students love Google surveys. My collaborator on this, the book I'm writing about how to actually do the responsible classroom, where your students actually learn how to be adults in the course of any subject, whether it's biophysics or English. When she gives back student feedback on papers, she does it in the form of a Google form. So for every feedback comment, students respond to the Google form about the specific feedback. So it's a way of having students in their own privacy, their home, can read the comments on their papers and then respond to the responses. It's an amazing way to make sure that the comments really are being absorbed and put into future work. It's really a clever, I've not done that myself, but I'm really intrigued. She's shown me several of the responses by her students, and it's so impressive. You can just see people improving, even in engaging comment by comment in the Google Forms. You guys are great. These are fantastic, fantastic questions. Thank you so much. I think now we should turn this over for Q&A. Is that, Steve, does that sound good to you? How are we doing for time?
We have 15 minutes,
oh, great.
We have almost 20 minutes for discussion.
Perfect. Anyone want to take one of these wonderful comments in the chat and turn it into a question or a comment for the whole group, or anything else?
And and although we had initially said, put questions in the chat room and let the moderators ask, that's not how we're actually running the conference. Now that we've entered into the discussion period, please feel free to unmute and ask questions, make comments, and go into a discussion. for those of you who were here earlier today, the discussions got very lively.
Very lively. Thank you. Anyone? Any questions?
Don't make me call on you.
I'd like to hear more about the class that you were talking about, Cathy, that you taught.
The general education class?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've taught many variations of it. The most radical classes I teach, my students make the syllabi, and sometimes I tend to co-teach with somebody who's never used these methods before, and now we tend to have the students write half the syllabus. But when I was doing it on my own, I would often come in the first day of class, and the topic would be something like your future or the future of higher education, and that means some title that was respectable on the college catalog, but it was really a class about how can we make this 12 weeks that we have together in the same room be as meaningful and important and as transformative a preparation for your life as possible. And then I would leave the room and say, okay, self-organizing groups. I'm going to come back in 45 minutes, come up with 4. So the basic thing I always do is put up the calendar, because no one should have to be creative and figure out when Easter break is and all of that stuff at the same time. So I put up the calendar, have students organize into 4 or 5 or 6 groups, depending on the size of the class, and come up with topics they wanted to work on. And then I would work with them in groups to make the topic for the class. Sometimes that's the future of higher education. Sometimes it's what do I need to know to be prepared for the rest of life. And then it would always work out that the students who were quantitative would become the experts in statistics and teach us some kind of statistics class that we wanted to know. Last semester when I did this, what was that class called? I think the course catalog title was Introduction to Engaged Teaching and Transformative Learning in the Humanities and Social Sciences, something very vague like that. And I taught with a professor from Eduardo Viana from LaGuardia Community College. And one of the groups for that turned out to be people with a lot of computer science knowledge, who taught a class on what questions we have to, their segment was what things we have to ask anytime we see so-called data that's being given out to us about COVID or anything else. What questions do we ask about sample size, about test bases, about the statistics, about what is the statistic relevant to? I'm a math geek. That's my passion in life. And I learned things from that I never thought of before. Questions to ask. Who's asking the questions? What other studies have been asked? And but these are all self-organized classes, often around either a specific topic or a general topic. But I always have students do at least half of the class where students actually do the work. And then I teach the groups as if they're project groups at a workplace. So people write their own job descriptions, and every week they come in and give each other badges if they fulfilled their job. They never say anyone didn't do their job, but you only get a badge if you did. Because I think one reason students hate group work is one person ends up doing all the work and everybody else either feels like a loser or like they got away with murder, which is the same thing. So we really teach project management, and that goes on the resume that everybody leaves the class with. But I teach many variations of that class. They're all on HASTAC too. We do a recap of my classes on HASTAC, and the student writing is on HASTAC as well. Later on, I can put up some HASTAC. I can put up some links to some of those classes so you can see the syllabus we start with, how they evolve, the projects people do. And it's too big a dive to tell somebody who's never done it before to just let students do it. So I do these things because I've got tenure, blah, blah, blah. I've got to, but I like to do the most radical things so other people can do smaller things. And I see in the comments you're already doing those. The Think, Pair, Shares every class, the exit and entry tickets, things that just say to students, what you're thinking and what you're doing matters. And not just the so-called best students, but all of you matter. All of you are paying for an education. All of you are voluntarily committing to an education. You all matter. And wherever you start from, if you want to, you're going to end up at a higher place.
So I had a question
Thank you.
regarding how you viewed or the person you interviewed viewed their CEOs almost like with a sheepish approach. And I'm wondering this as a business major, why would we not follow a sheepish approach if it is like rewarded? If these people are being rewarded as CEOs with big salaries and everything, why would we not follow that kind of system?
If I'm the wolf and I have the major company in this environment and I see that my CEO is a sheep, I'm going to buy his company. And I'm going to take anything that's value about it and put his people out of work, right? That's the dog eat dog, the wolf world we're living in, right? So for the success of your company, the last thing you want is a sheep. The last thing you want, right? In other words, you want to empower your workers to help you succeed, right? That's self-interest. That's pure self-interest, right? But it's the biggest problem of business schools. And if you ask any CEO, they will say that is the biggest problem of business schools, is they teach you methods for not knowing when and how to contribute. It's dangerous to put your neck out there. So what are valuable, valued, safe, strategic ways to put your ideas out there in a way that supports the agenda of the company, but also allows you to support your own agenda and within a company, if it's a big company, actually even within pretty small companies, you have divisions that are constantly competing for resources, right? The sheep is not going to get the resources. What's cool about this is all part of active or participatory learning. It's as relevant if you're going to be a hedge fund trader as it is if you're going to be a community organizer, right? These are all ways of teaching you how to break out of this top-down, one-to-many way of always feeling subjugated, always feeling subservient, and learning how to have a voice. And there's almost no place where that's not important, including in family life, including learning how to raise children. You have 3 children, those are not going to be equal children. Do you really want one child to feel like they're the only good child in the family? They're the only one that's going to have a permanent record of being the good child? That stinks, right? So even in parenting, these kinds of methods are very important. And we all have been at the brunt at some point of being the person who was the loser. I certainly was for most of my education. I was lucky in that I have this wacky math brain. So that even though I can't count, I was able to do complicated mathematics. So I got scholarships to math camp. My husband knows if I'm depressed, all he has to say is math camp and I beam. Because it was one of those places where somebody selected me from the sheep and said, you have a talent, you have a special talent. That's a life-changing event in any child's life. When somebody says, you have a light, you have a special light. And as a business person, if you're a manager, if you can convey that to your people, if you can convey that sense to the people who work for you, not follow me, but I am so proud to be in a position where I can learn, we can all learn together and grow together, you're going to be the best manager and you will succeed. And that's a gift, learning how to make the people who work for you feel like they're working with you and they're in an enterprise together. Doesn't happen always. Wish it happened a lot more often. Thank you. That was a great question. Both of you. Thank you for both of those questions.
I have a question. It's very cliche, but what drove you or like inspired you to teach or mentor people?
Wow, that's not a cliche. I wish I knew the answer. I think anyone who knew me in high school would have said I would be I went to 4 different high schools and I've never been invited to a single high school reunion. Nobody would have thought I would go on to be an educator. I mean, I was the antithesis of that. However, I did have this one high school teacher who did an amazing thing. I was kicked out of this school that I went to when I was kicked out of my own high school. And my teacher, meanwhile, had gone to New Trier, which is the fancy, elite, wealthy high school outside of Chicago. And she insisted, rather than me being expelled, that I come to New Trier. And she put me up for an award over the straight A New Trier students, which took a lot of guts. And as luck would have it, I won that award. So I guess I did realize, thank you for that question. I'm not really sure I've thought about it this way. I guess I realized that this one teacher changed my life. And that was a powerful drug. And I wanted to be able to be in a position where I might be able to give that back to other students. I guess I'm not sure I've ever really thought of it in that way, but so thank you very much for that question. I think that really was a turning point for me, and I realized how important turning points are in every life, wherever they come. At any point in life, at any time in life, they're important. Betsy, do you have a question? I see your name up.
I had more of a general comment rather than a question, if
Yes,
that's all right.
sure, please.
You were talking about, especially like in a business-oriented area, because, that's where a lot of us are going to end up going, that, it's trying to encourage the like independent thought rather than, collective thought or the requested thought. And I wanted to add on that another thing that I've seen personally. I've worked as a systems administrator. I started when I was 15 for the ProMedica hospitals, all in Northwest and Northeast Ohio. And it was very like that way. They did not want like ways to improve it. They had their ways that they know worked, and
Right.
wanted you to follow his methods. I currently work at Best Buy, and to sum up what I do, a lot of what I do is creative thinking for
Wow.
problem resolution, and it's not only encouraged, but they actually have a basically a panel that sits, like, we sit down and we look at the company's policies, company's practices, every single thing about the company, and then it's like, is this helping us, harming us? Can we improve this and improve like efficiency? And it's not like at a corporate level. I work out of a store, and it's like at a store level as a normal employee. What would you change? How can
Wow.
we change that? So I think a lot of companies, from what I can see, and a lot of even our competitors, we hear about this too, are looking for this method to look for the actual employees that do the work to help improve. So I think that's,
Absolutely. When I was
part.
at Duke University, I was a vice provost for innovation, basically for innovation, and helped create what was called Duke Corporate Ed. And these were basically managers and CEOs coming back to learn methods. The skill you're talking about that you've been lucky enough to experience at this stage in your career was the number one thing these people who were coming back and paying a lot of money, insane amounts of money to get executive education, insane amounts of money for, I mean, more than any of us will make in a year, likely, was that ability to know how you get everybody to contribute to a situation in a way that's creative. So it's an interesting paradox, and you said it so well. Tell me how you pronounce your name so I don't mess it up.
It's pronounced Kosela.
Kosela. It's both collective and it's independent. In other words, how do you take all of the ideas from a group and find out the best ones that will work? And there have been many studies, actually, sadly, many hospitals are the worst offenders, where hospitals often don't know until there's a disaster that they had a method that was basically of turning everybody into a yes man or yes woman, where people learned that they would be punished for speaking up. And there are many, many business books about what happens to an organization. It's the kiss of death for an organization, where people feel that if they see something that's absolutely wrong and tell somebody, they're going to lose their job. That's a disaster, right? It's the last thing. If my house is on fire, I don't want someone to feel they're going to be fired for telling me my house is on fire, right? So you're very, very lucky to be in that. And what I try to do in education is bring many of those lessons I've learned from business as well as from progressive educators into the classroom. Thank you so much. I know you're working from your comment earlier, I know you're working incredibly hard, basically full time while going to school. And I admire you so much for that. This is going to pay off for the rest of your life. These are invaluable skills for the rest of your life. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I have a question. What advice do you have for someone who doesn't know what they want to do with the rest of their life?
That's a really great question. And you know, many people who know what they're going to do very early end up going through a midlife crisis later. So on the one hand, it's so anxiety producing not to know. On the other hand, I believe the average amount of jobs that people go through by the time they're 28 is 8. And that's basic. We all think, oh, old people always say, oh, young people today don't know their own minds. Actually, that figure hasn't changed. At least since the 1980s, when the first studies that I know of were done in a systematic way about that. So part of maybe what being a student is trying to figure that out. I like to ask deep, effective questions, and this is going to go back to the mindfulness we talked about earlier. Questions that rarely are asked, such as, do I prefer to work by myself or do I like to work in groups? Do I like to work indoors or outdoors? Do I like to have a set schedule with deadlines, or do I like to feel accomplished and like I can manage my own projects and know when something is brought to completion? Do I like to work in fields with artists, or do I only like to work with other computer scientists, or do I like a world where that's mixed up? If you ask those basic questions, that's why I asked the question that Alanis Morissette asked herself. I forgot her name earlier. Alanis Morissette, who are you? If you can answer those who are you questions in a kind of inventory of all those really practical things, how do I like to spend my days? That helps you weed out what you're going to fail at, right? If you're doing something you hate, 40 hours or 50 hours a week, how can you, you're fighting yourself in order to succeed. It's much easier to succeed when you're doing something you love. That doesn't mean you'll get paid well for it. Doesn't mean you'll get paid well for it if you hate it either. Right? So as long as you're going to be in a situation of work where you're being paid for your labor, it's ideal if you can have something closer to the things that are your values, the things you like. Do an inventory of how you spend your time, right? Is it playing video games? What is it about video games you like? Is it the competition? Is it being alone? Is it the focus that you have from video games? There's certainly a narrow focus rather than a wide focus. Maybe you want to be in a job that requires a narrow focus. You know, there are many kinds of questions like that you can ask yourself that at least get you started for the realm that you might be interested in. I once had a student who was probably 35 when he came back and got a college degree. This was at my first teaching job at St. Bonaventure University. And halfway through my class, he said, I can't tell you why, but I think I know what I want to do for the next at least 5 years of my life. I said, what is it? He said, I want to build a boat and sail around the world. Whoa. He built a boat and sailed around the world and wrote about it, ended up writing a bestseller about the process and about all the people he met around the world. And it's, to my knowledge, I lost track of him probably a decade ago. But until then, he had made a career from this crazy thing that was both crazy and took absolute focus and determination, building a boat and sailing it around the world. Amazing.
I just wanted to step in for just a moment. Technically, we have a break, and we were talking about self-care earlier today, yes. Which is important, but we're also adults and can wander and take breaks as we need. So I just want to acknowledge that we have a break, but Cathy is able to stay, and we'll continue the discussion during break. And our next session will begin at 1:45.
Great. Yes, I have I teach teachers, and mine is at 2 o'clock, so I'll have to leave before them, but I'm so happy to stay for the next 15 minutes or so and talk with anybody about any of these ideas.
Yeah, I have a question, if I may. So I had a training by a former vice provost for faculty development at MSU, talking exactly about the methods that you're describing and the kind of dynamism. But then I noticed that one of the students she was a mentor of, was it someone in my department in a position of leadership, and even then the ideas didn't trickle through. What do you do, and what can you do to get some of the dynamism out of this classroom into your institution as a whole?
That's such a great question, and sometimes it doesn't take 2 years ago, I was invited by a colleague to come into a seminar class that he was teaching. And on the way in, he said, 2 of my students are on the autism spectrum and they dominate the class. So I'm just warning you in advance, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. So you should just lecture at them. If you try to have them discuss, these 2 students are just going to go have a hard time and they will dominate the class. I said, let me handle that. And we did inventory methods for the whole class. Everybody was involved. It was a phenomenal class, including these 2 students. We were doing think, pair, shares and entry tickets, exit tickets, and writing things down where everybody structurally was contributing. I passed the colleague about a week later and he said, oh, that class, those 2 students just, I'm like, did you not learn anything from, you know, it was a great class and those students enjoyed it. It took the pressure off them. I mean, the thing, I talked to both of them since then, and being dyslexic, I often talk with people who have so-called cognitive or learning disabilities. And they said when there's a silence in them, they felt nervous and they had to pitch in, and they loved knowing that everybody was going to contribute, and they just did their part that was on the index card. They literally read their index card. That's what I often have people do to take away that moment of panic. When you have to speak, it's very hard for many people to just speak off the top of their heads. You know, so if you have something written down and people read what they write, it's much easier. How you institutionalize that, it depends a lot on the people involved. This year, I'm going to be running with a colleague, Shelley Eversley from Baruch College. We're running intensive faculty workshops, actually for 3 years, on these methods. Will people do them after they're no longer in the seminars? I don't know. You know, we're all creatures of habit. We all lapse. I certainly do about 1 million other things, where I promise myself I'm going to exercise every day, or I promise myself I'm going to do A, B, or C, and then I don't. It's hard to institutionalize these values because the whole point is of an inventory is to work against institutional top-down structures and to have people contribute together. So it takes a kind of a alacrity of leadership, a flexibility of leadership for it to be instantiated in an institutional way, and that doesn't often happen. I wish whoever was the manager at Best Buy would come to our universities and teach faculty how to do that. It's a real skill and it's a real joy in life when you encounter it. But that one I don't have an answer to. For myself, I tend to do programs that are voluntary so that the people who are working with me and are teaching me as I'm teaching them are people who really want to do something different, who really want to learn something different. Right now, happens to be the chancellor of the largest urban university in America, who's very interested in these methods and seeing them. How much that will make a difference institutionally, I don't know, but it's very, very lovely to have a chancellor of a system with 275,000 full and 275,000 part-time students who is very interested in this. One reason, because low-income students thrive in these kinds of methods. And especially students, 70% of our students were not our first-generation college students or were born outside the United States. And these are great methods for people who, for students who feel one down from an educational system that's told them their whole lives that they're inferior, which is so not true, so not true. I've been very fortunate to be working very closely with community colleges and teaching in community colleges for since 2014 when I came here. And I've never met smarter, more amazing students who inspire me more than my community college students.
So I had a question regarding, I work at a local fast food business. I'm a manager, and I manage a lot of my friends and other colleagues. And we're in a kind of a tough time right now. We had a high turnover rate. We lost a lot of employees. And I brought up the idea to my manager of getting like a hiring promotion. And we've used many in the past, and he completely he disregarded my comment completely, like it never happened. And I'm kind of confused because I don't know where to go with this. I don't want to work at a business that won't prosper.
Yeah.
And I kind of want my ideas to be heard because it worked in the past. We had a manager a few months. We had a lot of employees brought in. And I don't know why we wouldn't follow a similar style.
I share your pain. There's a columnist for the New York Times every Sunday and the column is called Social Cues. You can read it online. And I've learned so much from the way he answers questions like that. because before he gives advice, he's always very humble and says, wow, if my life depended on the job, I'd do whatever I had to do to get by. And I really feel like, you know, you're young and you're a student and you're working, you know, and it may not be possible at this job. And it may be that what you're doing at this job is already making values that you'll take to your next job and building those values for the next job. Because sometimes it doesn't work. It doesn't work with teachers. Sometimes it doesn't work with your employers. You try in every way productive to present an idea and you just, we've all been in that experience. It's a terrible experience. And again, I learned this is not me. I learned this from Philip Galanis in Social Cues. He always says, you're going to lose this one. So don't hurt yourself. Use it as a learning experience for what you're going to do next. And you will thrive. It just might be a longer timeline than you would hope. And I actually think that's smart advice. That's not rationalization. That to me is a very smart, wise advice from somebody himself who has been through that and knows that sometimes you can cause yourself tremendous harm that will put you back even further if you try too much at once. You know, so when I give people, when I go to institutions and help faculty like Matthias, who was frustrated that he learned something and then the institution didn't change, I often will help faculty figure out, okay, bring me all your institutional rules and let's see what we can do within those rules that will allow you to be as creative and as helpful for your students and as positive and nourishing for yourself as possible. Because the other thing is when you bring a good idea to somebody and they don't do it, it kind of starves you, right? You feel like, wow, I gave it my best shot and they put me down. So I like to say, okay, here's the institutional frame and the constraints. What can we do within those that won't hurt you in the short run? Or that you can learn from for the longer run? Because I don't know anybody who's ever been in a job that's perfect all the time, right? And sometimes you're in a job that you love and there's some part of it that just kills your soul day in and day out. And you have to learn how to be mindful of the parts that allow you to thrive and not put too much weight on the things that are killing you, because they will kill you if you do that. So some kind of measure of self-control, hopefully that you can then use to profit later on and to succeed later on. And I bet you will. You just, everything about you suggests that you're not only experiencing something. Oh, so that's another question. This goes back to Mathis too. I love that people think about the meta level, not just what I'm learning, but what it means that I'm learning this in this situation, because that's something that travels in whatever situation you're in. And you can take with you from situation to situation. Okay, you know, I was shot down here. I was trying something and I was shut down here. What can I learn from the process of being shut down that I can make sure I never do to somebody else? That when I'm a manager in a position of power, I remember what that was like to be in that position and how hurtful it was to me. Your company might fail because they didn't listen to you. That's huge advice. That's like a year of executive training at Duke University for $300,000 a year to learn that and learn you won't do that as a manager.
May I ask that, you know, as we're coming to the end here, that this might be a good way to reflect on what we've been learning from Dr. Davidson. And so maybe, Cathy, if you could help me phrase the question for the chat room about what is something that we have learned, maybe that's it, you know, what is something that we have learned in our educational career that we will never do again, or that we will never do because we experienced it?
Perfect. That we'll never do again and we'll never do to somebody else.
They'll never do something. So if you could share that in the classroom, or in the chat room, and we can compile these and make these ideas available. But what are those things that we will never do again or will never do to somebody else?
I have a long list.
Good.
I have a very long list of things that I have vowed to myself I will never do to another person that happened to me at some point in my career. And I just I will never do that to somebody else. I just won't do that.
From the response in the chat room, everybody is perfectly satisfied with their experience and wouldn't change. Oh. Thank you, Brett, for starting us off. And the students who are with us, you could even, you could say things, share what you would, you hope would never happen to somebody else, or also on a positive note, what is something that you would do again?
That's a good one too. That's a great one.
So feel free to share, what you would do again, or that you would want to do to somebody else.
The thing I learned from that high school teacher I told you about is to give people a chance, even if they seem like they don't deserve one. You never know. Giving somebody a chance, it's a good thing. Oh, you are the weakest link as a form of class discussion. That just gives me chills. That's horrible. It's horrible. And you know, the person that suffers as much as the person who feels they're the weakest link is the person who feels like they're the strongest, because they're not. It's a self-deception that will kick them in the butt at some point in their career.
I've been teaching international students forever, it seems. So one of the things I've stopped telling any of my students is when they're checking their grammar or syntax, it'll just sound right. Not if you don't speak English.
No, no.
But that's something my teachers told me growing up, and I grew up in like this happy little bubble of all American, all like super white everything, and I'm like, no, dumb Julie.
The three classes that are most likely to contribute to students dropping out of community college are English as a second language, calculus or trig, the required math class, and this one just threw me until I really started studying it and reading the survey data and the ethnographic data, American history. And the reason is, if you're not from America, there's all kinds of cultural things we just assume that everybody knows. So I once had a student from Peru who, in a job interview, somebody was asking something about the Civil War, and he said, which Civil War? And they just, that was the end of his, it was not a job interview, a scholarship interview. They kicked him out. And then it turned out he was Quechuan. Well, there have been lots of civil wars in Peru. He didn't know there was only one civil war in America. He thought he was being a good student. And you just think about all the things we just, even when we say no one remembers history, there actually are certain cultural things we do know, and those aren't transmitted. But that was very interesting to read that ethnographic study in that. And it's similar to what you're saying about, oh yeah, it's easy, just do what feels right. No, you have to have a lot of confidence to feel right, right? That's what cultural bias or cognitive biases are. There's something called expert blindness, which means you think you're an expert, so there's so many things you don't see because you believe you know everything. You believe you're seeing everything.